right, so yeah, today's workshop is going to be just a quick refresher on some things that we typically see in the springtime that, um, just a good refresher to catch up on for the springtime as we enter burn season. I know that there's been a few burns happening out there. It's looking like we're needing a little bit of moisture, just a kind of quick shot of moisture for most people to kind of start burning. But overall, it's looking like it's going to be a good spring for some prescribed fire. So just briefly kind of touch on some weather. As we know, the difference between prescribed fire and our wildfires is that we get to choose these variables when we're doing our prescribed burns. And so, they're really important to our fire behavior. And so we get to pick those. The first one that's really common this time of year, one of our primary weather elements that affect our fuel moisture is relative humidity. And this is just the amount of moisture that is in the air. And so typically what we see is, when you have lower humidity, you're going to have increased in that fire behavior. So typically 20% is usually our cutoff of where we're not burning below 20%. If you can meet your objective at 30%, sorry, dog's playing with this toy. If you could get away with burning at 30% humidity, 40 or 50% humidity, you certainly can do that. But once you get down to 20%, that humidity increases that fire behavior pretty dramatically. So always keep an eye on that. Typically, when we see this inverse relationship, so usually the warmest, hottest part of the day, between 2 and 5 p.m. in the afternoon, is when we're going to have our lowest relative humidity. So you can see here on this graph, 5 p.m., 82 degrees. It's going to be at our lowest point, 18% humidity. So when we're planning our prescribed burns, we don't want to, typically we're going to be out of prescription if we're below 20%. But that doesn't mean we can't start at, 8 a.m. and burn until noon or 1 o'clock until, when that temperature is, or that relative humidity is below 20%. But you want to be pretty much done with your burn before that happens. If you start your burn at 3 p.m. when it's already at 20%, and you're trying to put in your back line, it's going to be a lot harder for you to control, and you may have some spot fires over that line. So humidity is really, really key. Wind is also another big factor. Wind, obviously, here in Nebraska, as of late, we've had some really strong winds, really gusty wind days. But it's also the most difficult element that we predict. We'll go in and talk about how to look up the weather and stuff. But when these winds are coming through, a lot of times there's a lot of variables that can be influenced. Especially terrain. Terrain can influence it. We've seen burns where we got a southwest wind and it goes through like a draw or canyon area and it pops out the other side and you got a straight east wind out of it. So wind can be very difficult to predict, especially for the National Weather Service and these models. But the wind influences our environment obviously by increasing that oxygen supply. And the good thing about wind is it also determines our direction of fire, right? That's why we burn with a minimum of 5-mile-an-hour wind. Because if you have no wind, what happens is that wind is basically, or that fire is creating its own directionality. So at one moment it could be moving one way and it stops dead in its tracks and it'll start moving in a different direction. And so you can see that having a good, supply of wind is going to push that fire in the direction that we need. And of course, it increases that fuel drain. So stronger wind is going to pull more moisture out, which can be a good thing, especially early in the morning. If you got higher winds, it can help dry out vegetation if you got a light batch of precipitation the night before or the day before. But wind can also influence our other parts of our environment, especially when it comes to smoke. So the higher the wind, the more that smoke is going to lay down on the ground. So if you're burning with a 20-mile-an-hour wind, that smoke is going to hug that ground longer than it would if it was 5 mile an hour. It's going to typically go up a little more. So wind is considerable when we do it, and we typically are going to be using winds anywhere from 5 to 20 miles an hour. We do burns over 20 miles an hour. Typically, it's in woodlands, and that's just because of the trees actually decrease the amount of speed through the woodlands. So it could be blowing 30 miles an hour outside, on the ridge top or something like that. And you go down in the woods and it's, it feels like it's only blowing 10, 15 miles an hour. So we actually need that wind to carry in leaf litter sometimes. Precipitation typically is a very temporary thing, right? Beyond just getting the ground wet, so you can't actually travel your fire break. If it rains enough to get muddy, that could affect your burn, traveling the burn. But precipitation, when it comes to our grassy fuels, they're called 1 hour fuels because it typically takes about an hour for that moisture to absorb and leave. And so a quick shot of precipitation, if it's rain, and it's a very light rain, if the sun comes out, that moisture can leave, within an hour. Kind of depends on those factors of wind, temperature, humidity, all those things. And temperature also, again, this is going to, like I said, accelerate that evaporation. So we get that quick shot of rain or something, higher temperature is going to reduce that amount of energy needed to ignite those fuels. So our higher temperatures are obviously going to be increasing fire behavior. Sky cover can also have an effect on our fire behavior, basically from the increased shading. So it's going to decrease the amount, how fast things are drying out there. So if you get that precipitation, you get some cloudy weather, it's going to take a lot longer for that grassland, this 1 hour fuels to dry out. When we burn our oak woodlands in the eastern part of the state, many times we'll be burning and just one single cloud will get in front of the sun and block it out. And you can immediately see the impact of that as that fire behavior basically just collapses. Another thing that we need to be looking at is our atmospheric stability. And you can look up this on the weather too, the Haynes index. We're typically burning probably 4 and 5 is typically when we're burning with the stability of the atmosphere. Once you get into 6, it's pretty high. You're going to see more dust devils, obviously. More fire whirls, maybe increased spotting across the line. If you're at Haynes Index 2 or 3, it's a lot harder to burn, especially in lighter fuels. So you sometimes need that unstable atmosphere in order to burn, have a better burn. So when we're talking about weather, we'll kind of shift into a little bit about climate. So we've had this winter has been very dry for most of the state. I know here at my place, I've had like literally a dusting of snow as precipitation, like all winter. That's all we've had since I don't even know when. But the National Weather Service, NOAA, puts out these 30-day forecast and kind of like longer range forecasts. So right now, from a temperature outlook, they've kind of got us at equal chances below normal temperatures and above average temperatures for basically the month of March. So that basically what that means is that it's going to be warm sometime, and it's going to be colder probably some other times. Same thing with the monthly precipitation, kind of equal chances. You can see though from my experience, they've got above average precipitation for the eastern part of the country, which basically means there's going to be storm systems that are going to move through. They just may not. They may just kind of slowly miss Nebraska as like a jet stream kind of dips down and takes these storms out of the way. So probably looking at another dry March. Doesn't mean we're not going to get any precipitation from those. I know there's chances of rain this weekend and maybe some later next week as well. And hopefully we'll get some of that. And they also do seasonal outlooks. So this is a seasonal outlook for March, April, May. And again, they have us being a little above normal from a temperature standpoint. So we can see that, it may be a pretty good season for us to burn, not have too many really cold days. And then the western half of Nebraska is looking more below normal as far as a precipitation outlook. And then you can see that kind of same spot over here of above average chances for the east, and then equal chances in between. So kind of hit or miss on the eastern part of the state, and trending more dry on the western part of the state, which is not normal if you live in the Panhandle or in the southwest corner of Nebraska, which is always 10 degrees warmer than we are usually. And then, of course, we are been slowly kind of working our way into drought. You know, they always say, old farmer told me, you know, if we're going to have a drought, the winter's the best time to do it. So hopefully we end up getting some more moisture, but you know, we are pretty dry. The one thing I always say is that you got to be careful. We have to be careful a little bit when we talk about drought and prescribed fire, because you know, we need it obviously dry to do our prescribed burns. You know, so even just, you know, a quick shot of moisture, you know, a lot of times it just calms people's nerves as far as, you know, okay, we're good to burn now. But when we're burning our grassy fuels, like 1 hour fuels, you know, we're typically looking, you know, you're looking at 1 hour fuels. So a quarter inch of rain is not going to do much except for making muddy outside. You know, our fuels are probably going to dry out. And most of our fire behavior, fire weather is going to be more in terms of our temperature, humidity, and our wind. And so drought shouldn't affect you from burning as much. You know, and there's a caveat to that a little bit when we look at some of our fuels. But you know, if you're looking at burning rangeland and stuff too, you know, it obviously affect if you want to burn the rangeland. But having a longer term drought can be good for killing cedar trees. The cedar trees are really dry out there right now. I got a report this morning that they were saying that, you know, they're just kind of snapping when they're cutting them with the shears instead of, you know, typically if they have enough moisture in there. So drought's not always a bad thing for fire. Long-term drought's not good for us though. So how do we, when we're talking about weather, there's a lot of different places to look up weather. These are some of the different things that I look at from a weather standpoint. Weather.gov. They have this new fire weather dashboard, which is really cool to utilize. It provides really good information. You basically just click on where you want to, you know, get your forecast out, and you can zoom in, get your forecast here. And this is going to give you a good summary of all of our different parameters that we're typically looking at when we're trying to plan a prescribed fire. Up here, they give you more of like, okay, you know, here's a daily, like what's our max temp, what's our minimum temp, max RH, minimum RH, all those different things. And then it gives you kind of a general wind direction. And then down at the hourly table, this gives you more information. So here, 1 o'clock, or you're gonna have 72 degrees temp, 25 RH. You can see that it's going to bottom out at 22 RH at 4 p.m. here. Winds 10 miles an hour. They're going to be from northwest here. It's also got 20-foot wind speeds on there. Your mixing height, Haynes indexes, they're all on this plot. You can also, they have kind of hourly weather graphs on this one as well. The one thing I would recommend is if you do this, go to your configure plot look and change your graphic height. I think the default's like 150, and you can see how it changes it. It kind of compresses it so it doesn't really look as more visual, that you can actually see it. So I usually change it to 500. And you can see that really kind of bumps it up. You can kind of see the graph a little bit easier with our humidity. The one thing I don't like about this one is that it's a little bit harder to see the wind direction and gusts. It's the one thing I really don't like about it. I wish there was a way to zoom in a little bit more if they had like another tab right here. So in order to get, if you want to see those hourly weather graph or hourly weather, again, same procedure here. Click on where you want to be, and then it comes to this table, and you'll see hourly weather forecast over on this side right here, or it also shows up down here at the bottom. And also, you got to remember too, the further you're out on your forecast, the less reliable it is going to be. And so you want to make sure that you're looking 3, 4, 5 days out for decent weather patterns. But then as you get closer to 2 days out, 1 day out, it's going to change significantly. But when you get to here, a lot of times I'll put on some of the things. I'll use these toggles to get rid of some of the stuff that I don't want to have in here, just to help clean it up a little bit. And then that'll give you a very good overview too of the graph. And they always say the trend is your friend. So if you're trending, a certain direction of wind, that's good. Obviously, you can see if you're burning within, if you have any kind of wind shifts, you don't want to burn within, typically 6 to 12 hours of those. You can see that wind's gonna switch here Saturday from the northwest, which is gonna bring in our rain and snow and all that stuff on Saturday. Here's a really neat site that I like looking at for broad scale wind patterns. So one of the things that we typically see is, you could be burning at your place and 30, 40 miles to the west, they could have a completely different wind direction just based on the patterns of the wind and stuff like that. So I use this Ecology DuPage site, and you can kind of go see these numerical models under this weather analysis tools. And then what I use is the HRR, it's the high resolution rapid refresh. Click on your area. And what this does is you can change your time that you do it. But this basically just goes forward and you can kind of see these broad scale winds. You can see here they got west winds up in Cherry County, and then as you get further east, they're more northwest. And you can kind of progress this at the bottom. This is by hour, so there's 3, 4 hours from now. You can kind of see these patterns of winds and what they're going to do. So you can kind of get an idea of where you're at. So like if you look down here, you basically got a northwest wind here, but if you just go along the border here, you can see that the wind's almost coming from the northeast. So this is just a forecast model. So you could potentially look at it from this point of view too. Is what if you're right on that border and you're getting northwest and northeast push? You can use this for determining kind of maybe what corner that you're starting on. There's a lot of other really cool information on this site too if you want to play with it. Another one I like, I'll look at every once in a while, is these wildland fire assessment system. It kind of has like fire danger. This is more of kind of like wildfire that they use. But the one thing I really like using is the dead fuel moistures. So they basically take measurements of like 10-hour fuels, 100-hour fuels, and it gives you an idea of how dry those larger fuels are. So here are the 10-hour fuels. You can see that a lot of the state, between 7 and 15%, and then as you get up into the northern part, northeast, you have a little bit more moisture in those 10-hour fuels, which can, and the reason why we use that, those 10-hour fuels are a good indicator of a lot of times for Mopup, because we're burning 1-hour fuels typically from our grasslands. But 10-hour fuels are going to be your smaller diameter sticks and twigs and branches, and they also have 100-hour. But it can be a good indicator of how well you need to mop up. So if you have a lot of stuff that's getting up in the trees and such that, there'll be you can use it to kind of see where things are at. And it's pretty obvious. We've been dry all winter, so those big sticks haven't been taking in any moisture. The final one is the Mesonet data. This one is basically real-time forecast. and they have all these different weather stations across the state. So if you go and click on it, you can see here in Ord, they got northwest winds. It's currently 73 degrees. RH is 22%. Northwest winds at 13 miles an hour. So you can kind of see that as a real-time update. The other thing that you can do too is you can go over here to your add the forecast. So you can basically look at what future forecast is and click on, maximum temperature, or you can do wind speed direction. It should. There we go. So they have a time slider button too, so you can look at the future forecast. So this would be, current, current forecast, and you can kind of see what's really cool about this is you can see kind of the wind patterns. Like, here at this station, they've got northwest winds. You can see that northwest coming in there. You can kind of see this one here. It's getting more of a north push. You can kind of see those winds, how they're folding down like that. Changing that. So you can actually use this to slide forward. It takes a minute to update. And you can see how it changes. So how things are shifting to the northeast later this afternoon. So those are things that I use on a pretty frequent basis, just to kind of every day. I already talked about those. There's the 100-hour fuels. Okay, so shifted into burn permits, burn plans. Again, this comes up every year. Any prescribed fire that happens in Nebraska, they need two things, mainly two things. Is the burn plan, right? It is required by state statute. You can look up the statute. You can also look at some of our other YouTube videos on how to write burn plans. And then you also need a burn permit, and that's going to be issued by the fire chief or their designee. The big thing that I've seen it a couple times in the last couple of years, where they're issuing 60-day permits or something like that. Make sure that you only get one for 30 days, and then utilize and then get another one in 30 days if you need to get it again. But many chiefs will only issue a permit the day of the burn, so basically it's really good to talk to the chief, because sometimes they want specific things in a burn plan, or they're only going to issue the burn permit the day of. And also, yes, I will post the links to the weather sites. So we'll jump into a little bit about fire breaks. Mode fire breaks are the most common fire break that we utilize throughout the state. And so big thing is with fire breaks, with mode fire breaks, mowing them in late summer, early fall is absolutely critical. If you haven't mowed your fire breaks yet, you're behind the 8 ball, and it can cause some problems. Typically what happens is if you mow it the day before, you get this like huge thatch layer that builds up. If you do it like in late summer, early fall of the previous year, it gives it time to kind of break down and flatten out and kind of get that. So it's always best to do it as early as possible the year prior. If you cannot, try to remove that cover if possible. If you cannot remove it, maybe try to rake it to the outside of the unit. The other thing you can do too is when you go mow it, you obviously mow it once, but mow it several different times and mow it in several different directions. Many times on your mower kind of creates like kind of a miniature windrow. So you can kind of use that, when it kind of windrows it into a little area. And then you come back the other direction and go right over top of that windrow. That helps kind of break it up and kind of spreads it out a little bit more, which really helps. And again, we like to have 10 times the width of the height of the fuel that is out there. So if you got 6 foot tall big blue stem, we typically want about a 60-foot width. Now they're, depending on how comfortable you are with prescribed fire, you can obviously maybe shorten that. Or if you have, crop stubble, there's no residue out there, you can shorten the width of it as well. But just remember when you're putting in your mowed line that you need enough area to travel with a vehicle. Two-way direction is a big one. People going this way, people going this way. You also want enough room that you're lighting in the middle of that mode fire break, so stuff falls over and slops over, it's going to fall into the black instead of over that line, which we'll talk about. The other most common type of fire break, and I recommend this one, if you're burning on CRP or previously tilled ground or flatter ground, distant rototilled is so much easier. It just makes a burn go easier. And again, you can start by laying in that or mowing in that late summer, early fall time frame. Multiple passes may be needed, especially if you're using that rototill. Multiple passes, you need it to kind of break up those really large clones and incorporate that vegetation, because you don't want any vegetation on that break, because any kind of vegetation they potentially skip across is basically just as you're basically using it almost as a mode fire break. So if it's not a proper disc rototill fire break, you might as well just use a mode fire break, which is going to increase the amount of water. The other thing to do too, if you do a disc fire break, is make sure you do a heat reduction strip. So go in and pull down some of that fuel so people can light right along that edge without having that really hot fuel fire right next to it with all that fuel. Typically, if you're doing a disc or rototill fire break, you can decrease the width of your fire break to 5 times the height of the vegetation. But most of the times, the difference between a good burn and a bad burn, or a not very fun burn, is how well fire breaks are prepped. So it's really, really important. It's obviously not green enough out there yet, but green fire breaks work pretty well. Again, mowing them in late summer. Typically, the only green up you're going to get is typically going to be cool season grasses, so brome, or you could use like winter wheat, stuff like that. But the a couple things to remember is that that vegetation can still burn if it has any residual material among it, right? So if it still has last year's vegetation, it could still burn. So removing that and getting that early green up will be good. But also, it's going to be a lot smokier due to that moisture content. So if it does burn, you're going to have the extra smoke. So you have to just be cautious of that. And that's going to help it. And that's why it's a good fire break, because it kind of slows it down as that fire gets into it. I see this every year when people decide that they're going to do a prescribed burn. They follow either their property boundary or their CRP boundary. Think outside the box when you're doing it to make it safer and easier to burn. It may be more practical to work with an adjacent landowner to increase the size of the unit, or it may be easier to decrease the size of the burn unit just to make it safe. To get rid of those dog legs, those wooded draws, things that are just going to be problems for you in the future. And that's just going to make the fire safer. I try to make my units, as round or square, as possible. Once you get into these kind of oblong, weird shaped, units, it takes, more wet line, more mode fire break, more patrolling on those areas. And then touch up a week or two prior to your burn. So if you got your fire breaks prepped, last fall, go out there a couple weeks, right now, today, this afternoon would be a great day to do that. Go out and look at those fire breaks, touch them up, run the disc over it again, mow it one more time, just to kind of, get another set of eyes on it right before you burn. Another thing that we see in the springtime is spot fires and slop overs and how to deal with those. So just as a refresher, spot fires are fires ignited outside the perimeter of the main fire. So you can see in this photo here, here's the burn unit, and then over here on the left side, you can see where those spot fires occur. And these are from really large, these are like 30-foot tall cedar trees that spotted this far. It's typical, not typical when you're just burning grass and stuff like that. But the big thing is when you're planning your prescribed burn, you need to just think of those things about, am I going to have any spotting due to volatile trees? And spot fires can occur even in grass, right? And a lot of times they're not very far downwind. It's pretty close to the fire line. But we kind of know when spot fires are going to happen. And Oklahoma State University did this study, looked at and basically made this data where if you're burning and it's 20 to 24% humidity, there's virtually 100% chance of a spot fire igniting if it lands in a receptacle fuel bed. So it doesn't mean that within 20 to 24% humidity that there's a 100% chance you're going to have a spot fire. What it means is that if an ember gets up and over your fire line and lands in a receptive fuel bed, there's nearly 100% chance that it's going to ignite a fire. And you can see as the humidity increases, from 25 to 30, 30 to 35, that probability goes down pretty quickly. And then when you get to that, 40 to 45% humidity, your chances of starting a spot fire decrease very significantly. Not zero, but very significantly. So that's why, if you can burn your grass and meet your objectives at 40% or higher, burn during that time. If the days only give you days that are in 25 to 30, or you need 20 to 30% humidity to meet your objectives of killing smaller cedar or bigger cedar trees, or even smaller cedar trees, be prepared to have more of those spot fires. I should say that most of our burns happen on days where we do get down to that 20 to 30% humidity in the afternoon. Slop overs, on the other hand, are fires that basically cross the control line, and this can happen either vegetation falling over, it could happen with a cow pipe breaking up and crossing the line, or even just your wet line drying out, and then it slops over on that side. So you can see right here, this is what happened here, is that they were lighting right against the really tall vegetation, and then that vegetation just fell over the top of our wet line and create a little slop over at that point. So when you're doing your ignitions along your fire breaks, here is the proper way to do it. Proper way is to basically be right in the middle of that mode fire break, away from that tall vegetation. So you're lighting right against here, and it's going to back into this taller vegetation. And so when that vegetation falls over or throws embers, it's going to fall into that black. And then you also leave enough room over here on this right side, the other side here. So in case something jumps, you have the ability to catch it before it jumps the fence. And you also have a path for people to travel along that way. Here's a picture of a fire that we did last spring, and you can see exactly where our wet line was. And you can see there's one up here too, but here's the biggest one that we had slop over. So what happened is that they were lighting right out here in the middle of our fire break, and it's just natural human tendency to kind of drift back toward the taller vegetation because it burns better. So, if you burn in this stuff, it doesn't burn very fast. So you're kind of waiting a little bit. So you get anxious or want to get going. So you start creeping toward the taller vegetation. So they lit this. And then what I'm assuming happened is that our interior igniter was doing the strip head fire right behind it and just got too aggressive with it, and basically just kind of was vegetation was falling over the top of that wetland. So if you have a potential spot fire or fire get away from you, it's always good to know how to get it knocked down. The best way is to pick the longest flank or the flank that might turn into a head fire, or on the side that has the most resources to protect. So if you have a fire get out and to the west it's houses and it's moving that direction, get that flank. Basically what you do is you start at the rear of that fire and you just basically work up to the head of the fire and put it out. You always want to make sure you try to fight from the black and have somebody follow up on an ATV or UTV. If you have a larger fire that breaks out, you're going to want to have 2 crews going on each side and basically pinch it off at the front here, but you always start from that anchor point, work your way up top. Again, same thing, follow it up with that ATV, UTV. Now, most of the spot fires that we have, we catch early, right? Because we have people that are out there looking for them. So if you catch them and get on them early, you want to make sure you fight them from the head. Don't give the head of that fire a chance to develop. Because if you let it develop, that's when you're going to have to shift tactics to the last 2 that we were just talking about. But if they just start, go fight that head fire, but make sure you're in that black and knock it down and then basically work your way back. Same thing as the other, just work your way in a different direction. Just a couple tips on those spot fires. Get it while it's small. Cease ignitions on the larger burn until it's under control, if it's safe to do so. Make sure you attack it aggressively, but stay safe. If it's too hot to attack it at the head fire, make sure you back off on it. Reposition your water if you need to. If you have a high chance of spot fires, it's always good to have somebody just downwind over your lighting, just to be there, even on a grass fire, until you get it backed off the line enough where you're comfortable to go. And then, of course, if you can't contain it, call 911 as soon as you think that you're not going to be able to contain it with your resources. And the reason why you do that is because 9 times out of 10, the volunteer fire department is going to be the ones responding 100% of the time usually. And they have jobs that they're at, and it takes a while for them to get to the station, put on their gear, travel to your site. So it's, they're not going to be there in 5 minutes. It may be 20 minutes before they get to the site, depending on how far you are from their station. So call early if you think it's not likely. Another thing to do is make sure you minimize your hazards on your burn that's going to cause problems. And most of these hazards are volatile trees, so like cedar trees near the line, or grasses like switchgrass, or trying to think of the name, I lost it. Sorry. And a lot of times there's a lot of excess residue too. So a lot of times we see that, especially people that mow the day before. That's my biggest pet peeve is you show up to a burn and they shredded the day before, or they're actively out there shredding while you're showing up. I've had that happen a couple times too. I'm just like, yeah, no, we're not doing that. If you can't get rid of, like you said, that residue, rake it to the outside of the unit. There's nothing worse. If you rake it to the inside of the unit, what happens is you get this big pile of windrow right on the line. You put down your wet line, and then that thing sit there, you rake it to the inside, so it's basically sit there and smolders forever and dries out your wet line. Burn your brush piles. If you can't do it in wintertime, it's best to do it in early summertime. When it's green out, wintertime is actually an awful time to burn brush piles. They don't burn as well, and they're probably the #1 cause of wildfires. I would say they are in our district at least. So looking at going back to some of our lighting techniques, this is a cause of concern that we see every year too. People doing interior ignition and causing problems. So when we're doing our interior ignition, coordination is really important. But you can see, basically, if you go back to our basic workshop on these strip head fires, you always want to start in that downwind anchor point, light your initial fire, your backing fire, and then once that fire backs off that line, you're going to come in with another strip behind it and kind of just slowly go, back that line, get more and more black. The biggest thing I see every year is that we get that initial line in off of the wet line. It starts backing off that line, and somebody comes in way too aggressive. I mean, so aggressive that the fire comes across our line or causes a spot fire. So the first hour in a fire is the longest because you're slowly, painstakingly putting in that fuel or that fire break, that downwind black. You can see on this next video that I'm going to show, if you look at the very first clip in it, you can see that they got the initial line in, and then the person is coming in taking a second strip. And you can see that that strip is almost too wide initially. So take a look at that, and then also see that we have patrol right behind there showing people or watching that to make sure it doesn't slop over. So you're basically just increasing your black as you go along, building as you go. So the next fire that you start is only going to jump into the black and not over top of it. Once you get kind of your downwind black established, another pet peeve of mine is when so when you're doing your black line, you initially want to have your drip torch like fully open, so you're got a continuous stream of fuel right along that. But once you get that downwind black established and you're still doing some interior ignition, in order to save yourself some fuel and go in and do this like point ignitions. So basically just decrease the amount of fuel you're dripping out, and then just kind of drop fuel every 5-10 foot. And that's going to save a bunch of fuel, because if you're still using the same amount of fuel you are when you're initially putting that line in, you're going to be going through a lot of fuel. And it's kind of a pain for the interior igniter to come back and have to refill. It just takes time. So wet lines, we're using wet lines majority of the time. We see a lot of problems with using wet lines. I like to use, in this photo, you can see that the truck, they're right in the middle where they need to be. And then you can see actually they're lighting or putting down that wet line right in the middle of that track, or where that tire track is. And they're lighting right off of it. But you can see the amount of water that you're using, the width and the pressure is basically going to be all determined by your conditions. So if it's really dry, it's windy, you're going to have wider wet line with more water versus if it is less windy, not sunny out, higher humidity, stuff like that. So all that's going to determine basically how long that wet line is going to hold. It's going to be, last less long if all those conditions are at their maximums. The other thing I like seeing is make sure that hose operator is inside of a side mirror so they can communicate with the driver with hand signals. Because typically you're not going to be able to hear, being so close to the pump, you're not going to be able to hear. So using hand signals to stop, start, slow down, whatever it may be, is good. So all these have different conditions that they're using, different widths, different pressure, amount of water. All of them take different things. So you kind of got to figure that out, and it's going to kind of determine all the conditions and fuel. Another one is patrolling. Patrolling is huge, right? It's probably the most important job on a prescribed burn. And basically, this is just ATVs or trucks or people on foot that are watching the line. And typically, what we use is we utilize an ATV or hand crew really close to the engine, and then we try to employ a second person on an ATV to go back all the way to the beginning of the unit to make sure they're checking for any spot fires or any slop overs or anything like that. And if you only have one person that's on patrol, that person basically needs to be going from, staying up close, but then also going back every so often, travel that line to make sure nothing is actively getting out of control. Hugely important. We have problems with it every year. Mop up is another big one. Mop up is kind of when, everybody's kind of wants to be done with the burn, but mop up is really huge. And basically that is just removing that material off the line, cutting down trees that are catching on fire, or, putting water on them, whatever it is, getting any of that smoke. And I don't declare a burnout for at least 24 hours. If it's in the woodlands, I won't declare it out for at least a week. And it's also going to depend on your forecast ahead. So when we're going back to the beginning of the presentation, we talked about the weather, check the next day and the day after to see what your weather is going to do. Because if it's going to be blowing 40, 50 miles an hour the next day, your mop up job is going to have to significantly increase. As far as your distance, right? Maybe you have to cut trees further in the unit if you're going to have higher winds. In our grassland situation, basically mop up within the first 15 to 20 foot is usually probably good. We use a harrow. You can see in this picture, we drag a harrow along the outside edge to break up any cow pies or clumps of grass or any of those things, basically because they'll sit there and smolder. So if you break them up, and they basically extinguish quicker. And we do that, go around that unit several times. And then a lot of times if we have any water left in our tanks, we'll just go ahead and dump it right on that edge of that line before we leave. But typically the landowner is going to be responsible for watching it for the next day, make sure everything's all right. Talk about drip torches and drip torch safety. Again, Panama drip torches. This is what I use, what I really like using. Big thing here is make sure that your wick applicator wand is on correctly and tight. We have little connections that you can use that help keep them tight. Make sure your gasket is working. Make sure all your valves are open properly and closed properly. Make sure you don't fill over that 3/4 limit. Typically right there, that allows the different pressures of that gas to escape. Same thing with that forestry torch. The only nozzle, the air breather, is this one right here. It's a little bit easier to control the wand and wick on this one because it tightens down a different way. But when we talk about our mixture, so in early spring, from now till April, I like using 70% diesel to 30% gas. And I typically want to use red dye farm gas because it's a lot easier to distinguish the mixture. In late summer or late spring and summer, I switch to an 80-20 mix, so it has less gas in it because the warmer is outside, the less gas you're going to need. And then you're going to want to label your fuel cans. Make sure you can distinguish between straight gas, straight diesel, and drip torch fuel. So we label ours, and then we also have tags on them that say what they are as well. We've had several instances over the years where people will fill a drip torch fuel can with straight diesel, and we're out there trying to fill our drip torch, and you can't get it to light. It just, no matter what you do, it will not light properly. Make sure you secure your drip torches when you're traveling with them to your vehicle. You know, if they're flopping around, getting banged up, it damages the torch and can spill fuel all over the back of your UTV. I've got a couple stories about that happening that are not great. So when you're putting them in a vehicle, make sure you close your valves before putting them in so fuel doesn't leak all over the place. But then make sure you open your valve or empty the torch for storage. What tends to happen is if you store your torch with fuel inside of it and you close all the valves, the gas pressure builds up, and the only place it has to escape is through the gasket, and so the gasket splays. And then if that happens and you don't have any extra gaskets, you either have to run it without a gasket, or the gasket's going to leak, and then it leaks all over your pants and all over your truck and everywhere, so you don't want that. So one of the new things that I'm starting to use more is backpack blowers. I just want to say, you know, if you do use a backpack blower or a leaf blower, just be careful on how you're utilizing it. Obviously, working into the flanks or on the upwind side is great, but you got to be worried about where you're blowing these embers, because you could theoretically or potentially blow embers, and those embers could go over your fire break and cause a spot fire. So just be cognizant of how you're using it. But they're a really handy tool. They save a ton of water. Really, and everybody has one, so they're really easy to use. Radio communication is always a challenge on prescribed fires. Couple things, you know, make sure they're all in the same channel. You know, we ran into a problem last year where we were using these just handheld Motorola radios that you buy from Walmart, and they work great and fine. But if you pull them right out of the box and they're on channel 1, like that's their default, well, any 10-year-old from anywhere can go to Walmart and buy these radios and turn them on, and they're on channel 1 also. And maybe you're out burning and they got the day off from school, or you're out there burning and they get home from school and they turn on their radios and they're playing their Ford or whatever. And now you got cross traffic with 10-year-old children playing in their Ford. And then they realize that you're on there and they start messing with you. So make sure you can use different channels. They have different channels you can use for those. Make sure they're all on the same channel. And that's why we do like a mic check at the beginning of a burn during our briefing. Make sure that the batteries are fully charged, or you have extra batteries. If you're not sure, you know, a lot of times they just take AA batteries. Some of these you can just go throw AA's in your pocket in case you run out. And this is really important too. When you're speaking on your radio, make sure you press down the button, wait a half a second to a second, and then speak, and then let go of the button. Every year it seems like, you know, there's always that one person or two people that, you know, they begin to talk before they even press, and so you only catch half of their traffic. Chest harnesses are a must. I don't like when people just wear the radios on their shirt pocket, because they're the ones that always lose radios. External mics are really nice because you get them closer to your ears so you can hear a lot better, and they ease communication there. As far as like what to wear, you know, you don't need to look like a wildland firefighter from California when you go out and do your prescribed burns. Just make sure you wear all natural materials and cover your body. Goggles are a must. You know, if you have really sensitive eyes that water up really easily in smoke, you know, goggles are really important. You know, at the basic, just get sunglasses, protect your eyes from any kind of embers. A neck shroud or a mask is really nice. Keep that smoke out of your lungs. Long sleeve shirt, pants, keep those embers off of you if you gotta get closer to the flames. and then kind of leather gloves and boots. Biggest thing is just don't wear synthetic material on the fire line, because if you do get close to the flame, you'll melt, and it melts to your skin. You don't have to be actively in a flame for it to melt either. You could just be like near it and it will melt that fabric. When we're utilizing our pumpers in the spring, make sure you have a job or a pumper unit that can do the job. A lot of times we see people doing prescribed burns with inefficient equipment, and they get themselves into trouble very quickly. So make sure you have the right pumper to do the job. This never fails to happen every year either. Make sure you fire up the pumper unit and run water before a match is lit. We had an incident a couple of years ago where they fired up the pumper unit and it ran, and then they just turned it off. If they would have run water through it, they would have realized that part of the hose was frozen, had frozen water in it, and so pump was running great, but we couldn't push any water through it because it was frozen, and the match was already lit on the ground, and so there was nothing we could do about it. So we had to put the fire out until we got the hose fixed. Carry extra parts with you for those pumpers, and it's going to be very specific to the pumpers that are using. In our burn units, we try to standardize a little bit our pumpers, so the parts would be interchangeable, and we could distribute those. But big thing, starter ropes are huge. Those happen on every burn that I'm on. Somebody pulls a starter rope and it breaks. Filters, water filters can get clogged really easy. Carry an extra nozzle if you got that. You can also carry different things for it. Oil, straight gas, you need all that stuff. A couple other things that I've seen as problems last couple of years is when you're running your pumpers, if you got these engine driven pumps, if you're just sitting around waiting, holding a holding pattern, not actively putting water down either on a fire or wet line, dial back that RPMs on your pumper unit. Don't have those things going full blast all day long. One, it's not great for the pump probably, or for the engine, but two, you're just wasting gas. So if you're sitting a holding pattern, just dial back that throttle, kind of let it idle. And then if you need to go again, all you got to do is push that idle up. You never want to turn off your pump, but you can just idle it, and that'll save you a lot of gas as well. Also, if you have any recirculating valves on your pumper unit, make sure that the valve is cracked open when it's not running. I know I've seen some people that, when they're running, they'll crank the valve down to get more pressure. It's not really needed, but make sure you open that recirculating valve, just crack it so water can bypass the pump and not build up pressure. And basically, if you do that, sometimes it will ruin the impeller on the pump. Make sure each vehicle has straight unleaded gas or diesel in it, both for the pumpers and for the trucks. Carry extra oil. Sometimes these units can burn through oil a little bit if they've got some leaking valves on it. I always carry stable for gas too, depending on time of year. A lot of times toward the end of the spring when our fire season typically ends, I just add stable to everything, every pump of gas, every gas I put in there, just in case it's the end of the season and that gas stays in there all summer. And then make sure pumps are all properly secured. Make sure they're battened down, not going to go anywhere if something happens. And this is a big one for me too. I hate this when pumps freeze or they get left out and they freeze. You got stuff in the line or cracks a pump. So make sure you winterize them after each use. If the forecasted temperatures are going to be below freezing, or you can't store them inside. We actually had a scenario a couple of years ago where it was above freezing, or right around freezing, and they drove down the road, and on the way to get it inside the barn, the pump froze inside the hose, or the water inside the hose froze. So you can do a couple different things. You can use RV antifreeze and just run RV antifreeze through it, or you can blow out all the hose with air, and then open up all your valves, drain the pump and everything. If you're pulling a trailer to a burn, either with a UTV on it or ATV or just one of our mobile prescribed burn unit trailers, check tires for wear and pressure. Make sure that the tires are good. We want to check and make sure that the bearings on them are good. So you may need to repack or replace bearings as needed on those trailers. Make sure the cargo is secure. Got a UTV. We were doing a burn a number of years ago. We were following a guy, and it was our third burn of the day. And we were going down, and we hit those washboards on them gravel roads, and literally watched the ATV jump off the trailer and go into the ditch. It landed on all four of its wheels, and he drove it out. But make sure you secure that stuff. And I've also seen this happen quite a bit too. These jacks on some of these trailers, they store them in the all the way up, and they're walking in and out and actually bends it, and then they're not able to actually get it back on the trailer because the jack got bent. Couple things with vehicles: make sure you always keep your lights on. It's really important. It's hard to see in the smoke. If you have one of those like amber lights, flashing lights, you can put those on your vehicles. Those are even better. Make sure you've got enough gas for the day. Fill up before you come, right before the burn, so you have enough gas to get through the day. Carry a tow strap in case yourself or ATV or UTV, or maybe something needs to be pulled out of the burn unit. A tree or stump or something like that. Watch out for tire killers. A lot of times when people go in and mow their fire breaks, they'll sometimes mow through shrubby areas. And those shrubby areas, if they get mowed over, they leave these 4 or 5 inch tire killers, and you catch them things just right, and they'll puncture your tire, and then you're changing the tire on the field during the fire. So it's always good to walk the fire break, or have somebody walk out in front of you to check those. Another thing is to check for any kind of ruts or holes. If you're in unfamiliar terrain, it's always good. You could have somebody just kind of walk out ahead of you a little ways to check, make sure everything's good. Changing or cleaning out your air filter after a burn is pretty important, especially if you're driving through the black, the area that had been burned. If you're driving through that stuff, and boy, man, you pull your air filter, it makes a significant difference on how your truck or your ATV or UTV operates after cleaning those things out. It also will save you a lot of oil changes as well. Make sure you're safely operating your vehicle in familiar terrain. If you're not familiar with it, things can go wrong. We've had people that have tipped over on ATVs or UTVs, especially when loading or unloading them. So just be cognizant of that. If you're driving a UTV or a truck, utilize those seat belts in case you do roll. After a burn, depending on where you're at, it's always good to check for invasive species. A lot of times we'll go through areas that have, Canada thistle or musk thistle. It's always good to clean that before traveling to a different unit, just to save yourself some headache for the next person. Then cleaning this debris from underneath the vehicle as well to prevent fires, so that rock guard underneath always collects this vegetation. So cleaning that debris out potentially save you from your ATV catching. And then someone should have one of those air bubbles for tires in case you need to air up a tire. It's always good to have one on a burn unit. There's no such thing as having too much water. Having more water than you need is better than not having water when you need it. So getting these water tenders from the co-op is a really good idea. some of the problems we have with these water tenders is the later in the spring you get, the harder they get to come by because they're being utilized for, you know, fertilizer, herbicide applications on farm fields and stuff like that. So that's why it's always good to get early in the season. Avoid these trash pumps if possible. Most times they just fling dirt and debris and clog up filters and decrease your pump life. We've had times where we've, had to clean out sediment and all sorts of stuff from these things. So avoid it if possible. If you can't, try to get the cleanest part of the pond you can. The one that I utilize has a bucket on the end of it that kind of helps keep some of that mud and stuff out of it. Before the burn season, it's always good to just go through these duties at a prescribed burn. I'm not going to go through them today. You can go check it out on our YouTube video. But just kind of go through and all the different, job positions on a burn and what those rules and duties look like. That's just as a quick refresher. Crew briefings are really important. Sometimes I've been on burns with people and their crew briefings are really short, which is good and fine if you get everything on there. But I've also been on burns where they just basically like, all right, ready to go, and everybody kind of goes. But during those crew briefings, just make sure you kind of go through your briefing checklist, your introductions, weather, map, your fire behavior, crew assignments, what hazards, smoke. At the end, I always ask everybody if they have any questions or they don't have a job or an assignment, just to make sure everybody's not just kind of wandering around. And if you're doing multiple burns or multiple units, regroup after each unit, just so everybody's back on the same page and gives everybody a chance to refill their pumper units, drip torches. Because you can get yourself into trouble if you go to the next unit without having a briefing or a pause in between, for that. Test fires are really good. Don't skimp on these test fires. Many times it's just a good opportunity for people to kind of get comfortable with seeing fire on the ground. Make any last minute adjustments to the plan. Adjust your nozzles to the correct width, the amount of water, get your drip torches dialed in. It's just a good pre-go activity. It's not necessarily so much about determining fire behavior or smoke. It is a little bit, but for me, it's about these other things. It's about just kind of beginning that process of a burn and just kind of getting everybody on the same page while we're all there instead of trying to figure it out after everything's already going. Again, I'm not going to go through this, but it's on our standard YouTube channel in the safety and smoke management. But review your safety considerations, your laces, your watch out situations, your standard firefighting orders for that as well. Again, some personal responsibility. Make sure that you're within your physical comfort zone. If you're not comfortable doing a position or a task based on your physical comfort zone, refuse to do that. Also, if you're getting tired, if you're signed as an interior igniter and you're getting tired and need a break, ask for that relief. Don't be shy about it. Ask for that relief. And then address any safety concerns you have with the crew boss or the burn boss. And then always ask questions. There's no dumb questions, especially on the fire line. So when we're talking about our burn timeline, 6 months out, you should have your burn plan done, your fire breaks in. If not, you still can do it. But, from my perspective, 6 months out, you need to have all those things already accomplished. And then about a week out, I start looking at my weather forecast. I get my burn permit, contact my neighbors, and double check my fire breaks. 3 days out, I'm still checking that weather forecast because it's going to be changing from that week out. I'm gonna get my fuel. I'm gonna plan a meal, get my drinking water all put together, and then that's when I'm gonna send an email out. Basically saying, "Hey, we're burning here," and maybe in the next 3 or 4 days, kind of get people on that mindset of I'm gonna potentially be burning. Then 2 days out, I'm checking that weather again. I'm checking that weather 3 times a day. Sending an email out, saying the weather's still good or maybe it's not. The day prior, I'm checking that weather again. And then that's typically when I'm sending out an email with time and location of the staging area, making sure I've got enough crew and equipment on hand, going through all my checklists. And then that morning of that burn, I'm up early in the morning, checking the weather one last time. Email again, go or no go checklist. And then in the morning of, and then you start your burn day and crew briefing checklist for that day. So that's just kind of a basic timeline that we go through. So what it all boils down to is, are you ready to start burning? There is a limited window in the springtime. Last year we averaged across the state about 10 days, and some of those 10 days were marginal days. And so, not only, if you're burning with a burn group, there's more than 10 burns that need to get done in that PBA. So, being prepared and being ready is the main thing here, because you want to respect, your time and everybody else's time when you're planning your burn. And getting all the burns done that we need to in a year can be a struggle. So basically just planning that. So I always end my presentations with we want more people to be like Homer Simpson.
You're doing it the sucker way. Try a little vitamin G. Relax. It's a control burn.
So with that, I'll take questions. I've seen a few questions here in the comments. Yeah, let me post the links to those sites here. For supplies, there is forestry suppliers or the supply cache are the two main ones that I utilize. Let me go back and get these links for you, and I'll post them into the comments, and I'll give you time to. Does the type of gas make a difference? Ethanol mix? Not for the drip torches. For the drip torch mix, you can use ethanol. But for straight gas, you want to make sure you use straight gas in your pumper units. Not use ethanol, especially if it's going to be sitting in there for a while. I believe you can also use kerosene as well if you don't. I think kerosene is more expensive than gas, which it's all expensive. It's going to be a rough year for fuel expenses. Are there any other questions? Typically, the burns that we do. Question is, how do you get a group like ours to help burn in the woodland? It depends on the time of year. Fall burns we don't do as many, so we typically I could come help, or we could have staff come help. during the springtime, it's a lot harder for us to get out just because we have so many burns going on that we typically only help our prescribed burn associations or our partners, with like game parks or TNC and stuff like that. So yeah, I mean, if you're gonna do a woodland burn in the fall time, just contact us, and we may be able to help. Can't promise you, but there are a lot of partners out there too that are willing to help out too. Game parks, and Audubon, a lot of different ones too. Any other questions? Did everybody get those links to those websites? Perfect. All right, well, that's all I had today. Thanks for joining us, and we'll get this uploaded later on. If you want to review it, go back to it. So thanks, everybody.